Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure here, and I'm hardly going to talk about Europe at all. It seems to me, and I was having this debate with Barry at lunch, Europe, in a sense, is a problem that's solving itself. Let us look at what really matters in terms of the party, the situation that we find ourselves in now. I agree with every word that Barry said about our national, international crisis. This is as bad as the Second World War, quite simply. And anybody who does not recognize that is a fool. It was therefore rather disappointing that the Prime Minister ushered in this conference by announcing a policy on plastic carry bags and apologizing to two lady Tory, well, one lady Tory and one not-so-lady Labour MP. Ladies and gentlemen, I am with Disraeli. Never explain, never complain, and above all assume that MPs, like policemen, are beyond apology or explanation. You remember this rather wonderful notion in the days when obscenity was an important issue rather than merely the currency of the chancellors of the exchequer speeches, when you had to testify that somebody had been corrupted. And the High Court sensibly ruled that policemen were either above or beyond corruption. Well, it seems to me MPs are either above or beyond insult. It's an absurdity. So the national crisis is there with a Prime Minister who apparently does not or cannot recognise it. This matters. Cameron has got admirable qualities. He's good in a crisis. He's fast, but in a very superficial way. He's fast on his feet. He looks right. There is not a single trace of strategic thinking about the man at all. There's also what matters to us more here, a party crisis. Now, this is a Tory party conference that is doing what it enjoys doing, being in government. Apart from the fact it's not. To quote my dear friend Norman Lamont, it is in office but not in power. So perhaps we should then look at what the real situation is. The Tories were defeated in the last election. That is to say, they did not win a majority. 2012 will see the 20th anniversary of the last time that the Tories won a majority in the general election. 20 years. To find a comparable interval between Tory victories in the general election, you have to go back to the 18th century. There is nothing comparable. To go back, what is perhaps more importantly, to an electorate which is as unsympathetic to the Tory argument as the present electorate, you have to go back to the middle of the 19th century. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you cannot win an outright victory against the worst Prime Minister of the 20th century, and in the middle of the worst economic crisis of the 20th century, for which the government is wholly responsible, when the hell will you win? There is no point about Lady Wasi talking about 2015. In 2015, the Prime Minister, possibly, will still be David Cameron. And the blame for the economic mess, which is most unlikely to be much better than it is now, will be the Tories. Why should we expect anything better? But this is not going to be about gloom and doom, though it's saying that the beginning of salvation is to recognise the mess that we're in as a country and a party. It is optimistic. Our chairman said, history. I believe passionately that history is not a passive thing. As Churchill, that great historian and the greatest Prime Minister of the 20th century, was, for Churchill, history was fecund. History created. History enabled you to understand better and to see more clearly. And our present situation is one which has happened before, almost literally, in detail. And the solution is there too, with the founder of modern Toryism, a man who is iconic in all sorts of ways, as our first Jewish Prime Minister. Of course, he'd sensibly converted, which made it much easier for him, and the founder of modern Toryism, Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli confronted an extraordinarily similar situation to the present. Nowadays, we have a politics which, as I shall say, very foolishly concentrates on the middle. Deeply unfertile ground to the Tories. That is exactly what Disraeli found himself with. The Reform Act of 1832 created an overwhelmingly middle-class electorate that was instinctively liberal. And we all know what that is. Have you ever thought why surgical bags are normally yellow? Because every form of rotting intellectual detritus goes into And for 20 or 30 years, the Tories were only in office for a few months at a time. Now, Disraeli's solution is one that is, we know what it is. It's called One Nation Toryism. Now, One Nation Toryism is a term that is bandied around a very great deal at the moment. But what it is not is at least as important as what it is. One Nation Toryism is not an appeal to the middle ground. That is exactly what it is not, because that middle ground, then as now, is occupied by the anti-Tory liberal middle class. What One Nation Toryism is a reaction, because again, Churchill, he did write one novel, but he mainly wrote history. Disraeli, of course, was a great novelist, and he used the political novel as a way of envisaging society. And in his novel, Sybil, he wrote about the two worlds of the rich and the poor, the two nations of the rich and the poor. And for Disraeli, the two extremes, the really rather well off and the very badly off, had much more in common than the prosperous, grab-grind, awful self-righteous buggers in the middle. And it still seems to me to be absolutely the right analysis. And in other words, this is what One Nation Toryism means. It essentially means the elite appealing to the bottom. And I still think that is absolutely possible. And there was a most brilliant obituary, because of course the 19th century, we are mere parasites upon it. The 19th century Britain was so brilliant linguistically as well as creatively. You know, Manchester at the moment is simply a Potemkin village, a shopping mall. It has absolutely no economic function behind it at all. But these buildings were once real. And that age, one of the great obituaries put it like this: Disraeli, like a sculptor, looking at a block of marble and seeing a winged angel within it, looked at the working class and saw solid Tory voters. And ladies and gentlemen, Disraeli, like that sculptor, was right. He began the enfranchisement of the working class in 1867, and it's more or less completed for men in 1884. And from that point onwards, the Tories become and remain for the next 110 years the natural party of government. Now, there are two elements to this. The first is you need measures that directly appeal to the working class vote. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were trade union reform. It is the Tories who incorporate trade unions within the political establishment and make their functions legal. Secondly, there is a conscious attempt to incorporate the trade unions and labour within the body politic. It's continued by Baldwin, a much underestimated figure in the 20th century, and it's vigorously encouraged by the monarchy under George V. For example, I have this rather quaint distinction of being a member of the Order of the British Empire, founded in 1917, deliberately so that yolks like me could be given a distinction. Before that point, only gentlemen, which for God's sake I am not, could possibly actually be given an honour. The MBE in particular is founded for the other ranks. Incidentally, the first investiture of the Order of the British Empire was held, can you believe it, by George V and Queen Mary in the Ibrox Park football stadium in Glasgow. That was how far the monarchy was prepared to go down this route. And they even invented an honour which was held by Churchill himself, the Companion of Honour, specifically for trade unionists and labour leaders, whom it was felt would, as it were, be too class conscious to accept knighthoods and peerages. Well, more fool them, because of course, as we know, members of the Labour Party and the trade union movement queued up, and followed most recently by the egregious John Prescott, to coat themselves in honours of ermine and badges and all the rest of the stuff. But that's the purpose of it. And it goes to the point at which, in 1936, at the now get the sense of the different world. In 1936, at the peak of the abdication crisis, Prime Minister Baldwin consulted, obviously, it was a three-party politics at that point, he consulted the leader of the Labour Party, he consulted the leader of the Liberal Party, and he consulted the president of the TUC, Walter Citrine. That was the extent to which Labour had been incorporated. My own experience is a very similar one, and I want now to focus on the other great, as it were, platform of this. So you need to incorporate the excluded into the body politic. How do you do it? Well, these measures that obviously benefit them, and much of the welfare state and so on. But the key element, and this is where I connect with the Bruges, the key element of Disraeli, of Baldwin, of Churchill, of Thatcher, is patriotism. The foundation of the free politics is the nation, and the heart of the nation is nationalism. A word that we have not dared to utter, and we must, particularly at moments of crisis. What would it have been like at the beginning of the Second World War if Churchill had said, I'm terribly sorry, we can't really be very rude about the Germans. You know, we do believe in diversity and equality of opportunity, and after all, we've got to respect Mr. Hitler, and we mustn't really, dear me, I'm sure everybody's got a right to discriminate against Jews. But can you imagine? Can you imagine? Now, my own experience, I experienced a three-party system very vigorously in my little council house where I was brought up. I can do the stop line really brilliantly. Anyway, the little council house in which I was brought up in the 1940s and 50s in Kendal. My mother, it's too shameful to say, but she was liberal. She was a natural contrarian. My father, less shameful, was Labour. And my grandfather, thank God, was a Tory. And the difference between my father and grandfather was patriotism. My grandfather was a Lancashire working class. Remember, we used to be the dominant political party in the northwest of England, in Glasgow. My father, this is the key, my father was pacifist, socialist, every bloody ist, internationalist, and God help us read the Manchester Guardian, which wasn't quite as sad then as it is now. My grandfather was a Churchillian patriot. That's the distinction. Now, remember, Churchill continued this, and Thatcher, well, she destroyed the notion of the trade unions as being patriotic or part of the political establishment, but she did appeal very directly and brilliantly to the C1s, to the skilled working class, with council house sales, but above all with patriotism, with an aggressive foreign policy, even one tinged with xenophobia. Now, to the present, what does this tell us about our present plight? Shut up, David Cameron, right? Later. The Cameroons call themselves One Nation Tories, but they are not. There is nothing further from what I've been describing than current government policy. Instead, modernising or detoxifying the Tory brand is designed to make Toryism appealing to the garden reading middle class. This is a waste of time. It is a complete and absolute waste of time. They will not vote Tory. And much, much more interestingly, there are not very many of them. We have this wonderful moment at which their numbers were tested precisely. It was called the AV referendum. And it was about 20%. I think there were 2 constituencies where there was actually a majority for AV, and I live in one of them in London. It was Islington, and the other was Camden. These are places that don't matter. They really matter. There is another utter and complete misconception, which is imitating Tony Blair. The whole point, I'm not talking about whether he's a liar, which he is, but let's suppose which he was, and whether his policies which were disastrous, which they were. I'm talking about, because in politics you have to do all sorts of horrible things if you want power. It's simply that it won't work. The whole point about Blair was that he was not a Tory in terms of party label. You can capture the soft right from the left, as he did, but you cannot capture the soft left from the right, as Cameron is trying to do, because they are too instinctively hostile. And until that very simple strategic point is understood, we are going to have disaster. And finally, and above all, the Cameroons refuse to invoke nationalism. Hence the present crisis. But not just one crisis, Mr. Chairman. The famous line is, never let a good crisis go to waste. Because of course, we've actually got 4 of them. We've got the economic crisis, which you described. We have the English or the England crisis, which was revealed by the riots. We have the British crisis in terms of the relationship between the constituent elements of the disunited kingdom. And we have the European crisis, to which you also refer. Now, it seems to me that taken together, these 4 crises offer both the necessity and the chance, the opportunity of doing another Disraeli and of rescuing, if I'm going to dare to use the word, both England and the party. Now, the economic crisis. As was brutally said by Andrew Tirry, this requires sensible, serious reform in education, in welfare, in public housing, and immigration. And the key point, ladies and gentlemen, is that all of these are profoundly popular amongst the C1s. A sensible policy on public housing, who gets it? I.e. those who are serious citizens and work and are responsible. A proper policy on welfare, that the shirkers don't get it and the hard workers who've temporarily fallen on tough times do. On immigration, the need to limit it, but without prejudicing those who are here already. None of this is anything to do with racism. None of this is anything to do with denigrating existing communities, and we must understand this. And finally, education policies which are colour-blind, class-blind, and blind to everything apart from talent. These are popular. And it is absurd that we back the opposite. What is completely preposterous is to back greed, to make fuel more expensive, to make gas more expensive, to cover the countryside in wind farms that are purchased from China and will do absolutely nothing whatever to solve the power crisis. This is demented. This is the morality of a Chris Spoon. We all know what that is. It also assumes that a typical Tory voter is Zach Gilson. We also know how reasonable a view that is of the Tories and our Tory voters and the British and the English. Because I think also, beyond that economic crisis, there's another central issue, which is the England crisis, the riots. Now, I have already spoken sensationally, in every sense of the word, on this subject, and I'm going to repeat it. The riots were manifestly about a particular kind of gang culture which began amongst blacks and has been adopted by whites. There can be absolutely no sensible disagreement on this. If you don't believe me, listen to Darkus Howe, and he says exactly that. Listen to Tony Parsons, and he says exactly that. But what none of those people do is to ask why this stuff, which is spurious, is preposterous, has been satirized by Ali G, why it has such purchase. The reason that it does is because in England, and particularly in the south of England and the Midlands, there is a complete vacuum of identity. people do not know who they are. In other words, to understand the riots, we need to know not simply where they took place, but where they did not take place. They did not take place in Scotland. They did not take place in Wales. They did not take place in Northern Ireland. And they did not take place in some of the most important and poorest regions of England, like the northeastern Yorkshire. Because what all of these areas have in common is that they know what they are. Now, I have a terrible problem here. I have been historically and viscerally opposed to traditional notions of nationalism, and I'm on record as saying that I think it's a glory of the English that we are about the only people in Western Europe who don't pretend to have national dress. We nearly had it, you know. There was a very serious movement in the end of the 18th century to adopt Van Dyck costume, which is why you have the blue boy and the red boy. Can you imagine turning up at Murrayfield with the broad tribes in their kilts on the one hand, and the English simpering in lace collars and blue velvet on the other? Thank God it didn't actually work. But there is now a real problem. Without a sense of nationalism, you cannot have a sense of common identity. You cannot have a sense of common purpose. And of course, in a crisis, what you need is a sense of common purpose. Why do the rich in England behave as monstrously as they do? Because they have no sense of common purpose. Because the City of London has become a city-state, complete with a fool, jester, despot in Boris Johnson, you know, completely remote from anything else that is happening in Britain, and with absolutely no sense of responsibility towards it. And why are we in this position? Above all, because post-Powell, English nationalism was identified with racism. Once the London dockers had marched on the side of Powell, they were not to be trusted because they were racist. And look, in the aftermath of the riots, after Clapham had been looted and burned, after Hackney had been looted and burned, after Tottenham had been looted and burned, a handful of whites marched in Enfield and marched in Elton, at which point, I think it was 5,000 police turned out to stop them. This is lunatic. This is an absurdity. This is disgraceful. Now, it seems to me, thanks to those other two crises, we can actually do something about it in a way that we never could before. The first is the British crisis, and the second is the European crisis. The British crisis, Labour's piecemeal devolution, means that Britain, and let us face it, as a unitary state, is dead. Absolutely stone dead. And the debate yesterday about the United Kingdom demonstrated this. It was led by 3 secretaries of state who have titles, income, offices, officers, and have absolutely bugger all responsibility for anything. If you wanted to cut government waste, close the Scottish office, close the Welsh office, close the Northern Ireland office. They can do absolutely nothing about the areas where they are. Now, it is ludicrous and it is demented. Now, it seems to me that as Tories, we were one time the Unionist Party, we should be the first to recognise this, as Thatcher cut the Boyle and Rhodesia and whatever. It also, of course, carries huge electoral advantage to the party, since England is supremely Tory territory. English Parliament would probably never have a Labour majority. But till recently, of course, the recognition that England should have exactly the same status as Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland was impossible, because it would have meant the complete breakup of the UK. The reason for this is the European crisis, because until a few years ago, the EU would have offered a welcoming and apparently pain-free home to an independent Scotland and perhaps an independent Wales, and perhaps even, because it loves statelets, as they're dependent creatures whose mouths open and shut, rather like goldfish to the crumbs that are thrown into them, Northern Ireland as well. But ladies and gentlemen, the European crisis, or rather the Euro crisis, has put paid to that. Scotland is too canny to vote for independence and the Euro. Instead, and I take a level bet, it will settle for home rule and the pound. This opens the way to a British confederation, perhaps even reincorporating the Irish Republic, an English Westminster Parliament, and a revived English nationalism, which will build on our historic success, what I referred to with Disraeli, with Churchill, with Baldwin, with Thatcher, in incorporating previously excluded groups, whether the white working class or immigrant communities, into the historic, generous, open, involving, decent English polity. All these things we should be boasting about. All of these things, we are not responsible for them. We are the fortunate inheritors. And it seems to me that this is the right place to be talking about it. The Bruges Group, although it is easily rubbished as being obsessed with Europe, the other face of it, as it were, that's the negative face. The positive face of the Bruges Group, and its great distinction is in this fact, is in recognizing that the foundation of a decent politics is nationhood, national sovereignty, and a responsible political system. And everything else is anti-democratic. I hate to say this word, the two Ds. Diversity is anti-democratic. The only way you can run highly diverse groups, in other words, multicultural communities or multinational units, is by empire. It's by top-down government, which is why the bloody French are so keen on it. The thing is a Napoleonic imposition. And ladies and gentlemen, you need either bureaucratic rule or imperial rule, or preferably a combination of the two. So this is the natural place to be talking about this, but also, ladies and gentlemen, to revive England and the astonishing, I don't know whether you've read that rather nice little Welshman, Simon Jenkins' New History of England. He says at the end of it, he has become a passionate English nationalist because he looks at what England has done. England invented modernity. England invented limited government, representative government, the rule of law, capitalism. You all think I've gone mad. It's not true. It's this is what we actually did. All of these things actually began here. It's our job to make sure they don't stop here. And it also seems to me to be a natural task for a revived Tory party, which I don't think we are at the moment. If we embark seriously on this exercise of the incorporation, reincorporation of the working class and immigrant communities within the kind of vision that I'm offering, we would win the North once more for Tories. It would give us as a nation the sense of common purpose that we desperately need in these tough times of financial crisis. And if he were up to it, it would make David Cameron genuinely his own man. Is he big enough? And that, I fear, is a rhetorical